The numbers didn't lie. That was the thing about a ledger. It held no loyalty, harbored no fear, told no flattering stories. Jessa had learned that at 19, sitting in a plastic chair at the county welfare office, watching a caseworker explain in a tired, practiced voice why her mother's estate had amounted to exactly nothing. Numbers were the only honest thing in the world, in Jessa's experience. Which was why, at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, she could tell that the books she was staring at were wrong. The import firm's third-quarter receivables didn't balance. They hadn't balanced for 3 weeks. She had chalked it up to a clerical error, a miskeyed invoice. Something fixable. But the longer she stared at the column of figures on her monitor, the only light left in the gutted, fluorescent dark office of Selwyn and Associates, the more the wrongness took shape. Not an error, a deliberate subtraction. Something drawn out slowly, column by column, from an account she hadn't noticed, was attached to her name until 40 minutes ago. She clicked back to the account summary. Her name, Jessa Callow, primary account holder, Selwyn Logistics subaccount, established 3 weeks and 4 days ago. She had not established any such account. The fire exit at the end of the hall banged open. Jessa didn't hear footsteps. She heard the specific quality of silence that comes right before footsteps, the held-breath pause of people trying to move quietly in a space they didn't know. She reached for her phone. Her hand closed around it the same second the office door swung inward and a man filled the frame. He was large, not bodybuilder large, just the functional, heavily built kind of large that meant a life spent doing things that required it. He wore a dark jacket, no tie, his hands loose at his sides. Behind him, a second man. They didn't look like police. Police knocked. Jessa Callow, the first man, said it like he was reading it off a list, not asking. She set her phone face down on the desk. Her heart was hammering at the base of her throat, but she kept her voice level. The office is closed. Yeah, he stepped inside. The second man held the door. We're not here about the office. They were there, it turned out, about $80,000. The drive took 40 minutes. They didn't blindfold her, which she wasn't sure was a good sign or a bad one. The city peeled back from downtown, the dense grid of streetlights thinning as they crossed the bridge toward the Port District, where the streets ran wide and dark between corrugated warehouses and the skeletal reach of cranes against the black sky. They took her to a building that looked like a converted freight office, low, long, discreet. A chain-link gate rolled back when the SUV approached. Inside, the lobby was warmer than she expected. Clean, a man in a grey suit sat behind a reception desk doing nothing in particular. He didn't look up. They walked her down a hall and stopped outside a closed door. Wait here, the first man, Tomas, the second one had called him, said not unkindly. She waited. She thought about running. She thought about the $80,000 with her name on it. She thought about her cousin Nate, who had called her 3 Sundays ago to borrow $40 and had seemed, in retrospect, extremely eager to ask about her job at Selwyn's, had asked which accounts she handled, had laughed when she said the logistics sub-accounts, the boring ones, not worth thinking about. She thought about how she hadn't heard from him since. The door opened. She had built a picture of what a man like this would look like on the drive over. Something loud, something designed to intimidate, the thick neck, the jewelry, the practiced scowl. That was the image she'd assembled from every piece of noise she'd ever heard about the Barrow syndicate. The whispers that circulated in the Port District like weather, like a forecast you checked before deciding whether to go outside. The man behind the desk looked like none of that. He was seated, which obscured his height, but she could tell it from the proportions. Tall, broad in the shoulder, built along clean, austere lines in a dark charcoal suit with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. His forearms were mapped in ink, old work, nothing decorative. His face was somewhere around 40, she guessed, with the particular quality of stillness that came not from relaxation, but from sustained practice. He had a scar that ran from the corner of his left jaw to somewhere below his collar. He was looking at a document when she walked in, and he finished reading it before he looked up. That was the first thing she clocked about him. He finished the sentence before he looked at her. Most men who ran things that required intimidation did the opposite. They weaponized attention. They stared from the doorway. They let silence do the work of a drawn gun. This one had better things to do. His eyes were dark gray. He looked at her the way an accountant looks at a figure that doesn't quite add up. "Sit down," he said. "Not warm, just practical." She sat. "You're the bookkeeper," he said. "I work receivables for Selwyn Logistics, yes." She laced her fingers together in her lap to keep them from trembling. "I didn't steal your money." He tilted his head slightly. "Thomas says you saw the account summary before we arrived." "I was working late. I found the account by accident. My name is on it." She held his gaze. "I didn't put it there." Barrow. She thought of him that way, a last name rather than a face, a ledger entry rather than a person. Picked up a pen and turned it between his fingers once, then set it down. "The account was opened 3 weeks ago. Routing number traces to your employment records at Selwyn's. The transfer signature uses your digital credentials." "I know what it looks like." Her voice was steadier than she felt. "Someone wanted it to look like that." "Most people in your situation," he said, "spend the first 10 minutes crying." "I'm not most people." "No," he studied her. "You're Nate Callow's cousin." The name landed in the room like a dropped tool, loud and unmistakable. Jessa exhaled slowly. "Yes." "He's been employed at Selwyn's in what capacity?" "He's not. He introduced me to Mr. Selwyn 2 years ago. Nate knew him socially. That's the only connection I know of." Barrow opened a folder on his desk, scanned something on the first page. "Nate Callow, 31, no permanent address in the last 8 months, 2 outstanding civil judgments, 1 restraining order since expired." He closed the folder. "Your cousin is a man who makes messes and finds someone else to stand in them." Jessa stared at the edge of his desk. The wood was old, heavy, almost black with age. Someone had maintained it for a long time. "I know what he is," she said quietly. "I just didn't know he'd make a mess this size." $80,000, Barrow said. "Withdrawn in 6 increments over 19 days from a logistics account linked to my family's operating fund." He paused. "That's not a mess. That's a statement." Something about the way he said statement made the small hairs on her arms rise. "I want to see the transfer documentation," she said. He was quiet for 3 full seconds. "Then why?" "Because I can read it, and I can tell you what you're actually looking at." She met his eyes. They were flat and extremely attentive. "That's the only thing I have to offer you right now, Mr. Barrow. I can't give you Nate. I don't know where he is. I can't give you the money. It's not in any account I control. What I can do is read a paper trail." She paused. "I'm very good at that." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached to his right, pulled a thick manila accordion folder from the edge of the desk, and slid it across to her. The documents were meticulous, which was the first thing wrong with them. Jessa spread them across the low table in the side room where Thomas had led her, the folder's contents arranged in chronological order: transfer authorizations, routing confirmations, account activity logs. The office had good light. Someone brought her coffee without being asked, which she hadn't expected, and she drank it without tasting it. Transfer 1, 14 days ago, $14,000. The digital authorization bore her user credentials, her employee ID, the correct timestamp for a Tuesday afternoon when she was in fact at her desk. But the formatting was wrong. She pulled up the mental image of every authorization form she'd submitted in 2 years at Selwyn's. Hundreds of them, the muscle memory of her own clerical habits. She always abbreviated the routing bank with a capital R and 2 letters. Whoever had processed this one had spelled it out in full. It was a small thing, the kind of thing that only existed if you'd looked at enough of them to know what your own habits were. Like recognizing your own handwriting, not by the letters, but by the way the pen had lifted slightly between the E and the S since forever, a tick so personal it never showed up in the letters themselves. She went through all 6 transfers. Every one of them had the same tells: correct credentials, wrong habits. Someone who had studied her enough to copy her access, but not enough to copy her. Someone who had watched her work for a while and had not quite understood what they were watching. She set the papers down. Then she went back to transfer 3, the largest $22,000. The recipient account on the authorization was a logistics holding company. Plausible, invisible, the kind of shell that sat in a document and asked no questions. She wrote down the account number on the notepad Thomas had left her. She had seen that routing prefix before. Not at Selwyn's. Somewhere else, years back, in the specific texture of a certain class of invoices that came from freight brokers on the coast. It wasn't Nate's shell, it belonged to someone else, and Nate had sent the money there. She picked up the notepad and walked back to Barrow's office without waiting to be summoned. He was on the phone when she pushed the door open. Thomas moved from the wall, one hand lifting, but Barrow looked up and made a small gesture, and Thomas stopped. Barrow said something short and flat into the phone and set it on the desk. "The transfers are forged," Jessa said. She set the notepad on his desk and kept her hand on it. Not well, if you know what to look for, but well enough to hold up if nobody bothered to look closely. "We looked closely," he said. "Your credentials are on everyone." Stolen credentials. Someone had access to my login information, probably for weeks before they used it. She tapped the notepad. "More important, look at this account number. Transfer 3, the 22,000. That routing prefix is a port-adjacent holding structure. South Docks, most likely. Nate doesn't have the resources or the connections to establish something like that." Barrow's eyes dropped to the number. He didn't react visibly, but the quality of his stillness changed. The way a room changes when someone in it stops breathing for a beat too long. "He was the delivery mechanism," Jessa said. "He used me as cover and moved your money to someone else. Someone who asked him to." A long silence. "Thomas," Barrow said without looking away from the notepad. Thomas appeared in the doorway. "Run the prefix against Creston's holdings. Full sweep." Thomas was gone before the sentence finished. Jessa stood on the other side of the desk. Her ribs felt tight, the way they always did when she was right about something that cost something. "Sit down," Barrow said again. It had a different weight than the first time. She sat. "Tell me everything you know about your cousin's financial behavior," he said. He had picked up a legal pad and a pen. He was going to take notes. "Income, debt, patterns, everything," she told him. It took an hour. She talked, he wrote. He asked questions that were sharp and specific, and occasionally revealed how much he already knew about Nate's connections to Selwyn's. At one point, Thomas came back and handed Barrow a folded piece of paper, and Barrow looked at it, refolded it, and set it aside without any visible change of expression, but the pen in his hand went very still for 2 full seconds. After Thomas left, Barrow said, "How long ago did your cousin contact you about the job at Selwyn's?" "About 2.5 years ago. He knew Selwyn from some trade event. He put in a word for me." "Did you ask him to?" She hesitated. "No, he offered. I was between jobs. I needed something steady." "And you trusted him?" She looked at the window. Outside, the port was a low, constant sound, machinery and water, and the enormous indifferent weight of cargo moving in the dark. "He's the only family I have left," she said flatly. "I trusted him the way you trust something you don't have a replacement for." Barrow looked at her. He didn't say anything for a moment. "Creston Industries," he said finally. "They operate out of the South Port District. They have been working to undercut my family's freight contracts for 14 months. He set his pen down. "The routing account you identified traces to a Creston subsidiary. The money Nate moved from my account wasn't a theft for personal gain. It was a finder's fee. Nate spent the last several months inside my information network, positioned there, through you, through Selwyn's, feeding route manifests and contract documentation to Creston. The 80,000 was payment for that." Jessa heard each word individually. Her brain processed them in the order they came. "He used my job," she said, "to get inside your operation." "Yes. And he put my name on the account so that when you came looking." You would be the answer to the question, Barrow said. A disposable answer. The word disposable sat in the room without shame. He hadn't softened it, and he hadn't apologized for it, and she found, in a cold and clarifying way, that she preferred that. She had cooked Nate dinner last Easter. She had lent him her car in February so he could drive to a job interview that, she now understood, had not been a job interview. She had called him 3 times in the last week and gotten voicemail and told herself he was probably just being Nate. Flaky, unreliable, he'd call back eventually. She pressed her hands flat on her thighs. The trembling had stopped somewhere in the last hour. What replaced it was colder and quieter and didn't shake. He knew you'd find out, she said. That's why he ran before the last transfer completed. He had a 3-day head start. Something in Barrow's tone said that this displeased him at a fundamental level, not as an emotion, but as an unacceptable operational failure. By the time we pulled the thread back to Selwyn's, the trail was cold. You pulled it back to me. Yes. And now? He looked at her for a moment. The room was very quiet. The money is already with Creston. Recovering it from them is a separate problem. He picked up the pen again, turned it once in his fingers. And Creston is mobilizing freight assets on the South Docks tonight, because they believe the information Nate sold them has given them a window to move on my contracts while I'm occupied looking for the cash. She understood then why Tomas had come back with the folded paper. You're not occupied, she said. Not anymore. He looked at her directly. Tell me where Nate goes when he runs. She held his gaze. What happens to me after? That depends, Barrow said, on what you tell me and what it's worth. It was not a reassuring answer, but it was an honest one, and she had spent enough of her life in rooms with people who traded in comfortable dishonesty that honest, however bleak, was something she could work with. She thought about Nate. She thought about the specific geography of his cowardice. The way he always ran toward comfort rather than away from threat. The beach rental he'd borrowed money for 2 summers ago, the cousin on his father's side in Beaumont, who never asked questions. The particular pattern of a man who had spent his whole life running short distances and calling them escapes. He doesn't go far, she said. He never does. He goes somewhere familiar, somewhere he thinks nobody connects to him. He borrowed a rental deposit from me for a place in Galveston 2 years ago. I never got the money back. She paused. He'll be near water. He always goes near water when he's scared. And he'll be somewhere he can watch arrivals. He's paranoid enough to want to see what's coming before it gets there. Barrow was writing. Other contacts in that area? There's a man named Crowell. I only know the last name, that Nate mentioned once as someone who could make things quiet. I don't know what that means exactly. I do, Barrow said. He finished writing, capped the pen. He looked at the legal pad, then at her. The account trail. You said you could read it. I can. Creston's subsidiary structure has at least 4 holding layers that we've identified. If the 80,000 moved through them, there will be a chain. He tapped the legal pad. How long to trace it? She thought about this honestly. Depends on how careful Creston's people are. If they're sloppy, a few hours. If they're careful, longer. But there's always something. She looked at him. There's always a habit. People can copy a process, but they can't copy instinct. Sooner or later, they do something the way they do it, not the way the template says. Same way whoever forged my transfers gave themselves away. Barrow studied her. She couldn't read his face with any precision. It was a face that had been trained out of transparency over a long time. She understood that kind of training. She'd done her own version of it, learning to take up less room, to speak only when what she had to say was useful, to be the person in a room that no one paid much attention to until they needed something counted. You came in here, he said, with no leverage, no money, and your name on a document that cost my family $80,000. A pause. And you're offering to work. I'm offering to be useful, she said, because being useful is the only thing I've ever had that wasn't taken from me. She held his eyes. And because Nate put me here on purpose, and I want him to have been wrong about the disposable part. The silence stretched. Then Barrow stood. He was taller than she'd guessed. The room rearranged itself slightly around him when he moved. He walked to the credenza along the near wall, poured 2 fingers of something dark into a glass, and held it out to her. She took it. She drank. It was good scotch, better than anything she'd bought herself in recent memory. "Thomas," he said toward the door. Thomas appeared in the doorway. He was good at that. Set her up in the records room. Full document access, Creston file, subsidiary chain. Get her what she needs. Barrow looked at Jessa. "You have until 4 a.m. That's when my team moves on the South Docks. Whatever you find before then is useful. Whatever you find after is academic." She stood, and after 4 a.m. He looked at her. His face gave nothing away, but his eyes held something that was not entirely cold, something that had assessed her and arrived at a conclusion she wasn't privy to yet. "After 4 a.m., he said, "we'll see what the ledger says." The records room was a long table, a laptop and boxes. Jessa sat down, rolled her sleeves up, and opened the first box. The Creston subsidiary chain was complicated in the way deliberately complicated things always were, layered to discourage rather than to actually conceal. 4 holding structures, 3 domestic, 1 running through a shipping address in Panama. She started with the domestic ones. She started with the habits. At 1:15 in the morning, she found it. A single line item in the 3rd holding structure's outgoing disbursements, 2 days before the first Selwyn transfer hit. Not the $80,000, but a payment to a consulting firm she didn't recognize. Small amount, $400. The kind of thing that meant nothing standing alone. She cross-referenced it against the routing index Thomas had left her. The consulting firm's routing code shared a prefix with a payroll service she'd used at her second job 3 years ago at a freight brokerage in Houston that had since gone under. A brokerage that had been, according to the small print on their vendor contracts, a subcontractor for Creston Industries. Nate had worked there too, briefly. She had gotten him the interview. She stared at the date. He had been planning this for longer than 3 weeks. He had been planning it for at least 3 years. She sat back in the hard chair. The fluorescent light above the table buzzed. She thought about the Easter dinner, the borrowed car, the $40, the years of being someone's contingency plan. She thought about the careful, patient architecture of it, the job at the freight broker, the relationship with Selwyn, the social introduction, the long unhurried work of positioning her exactly where she needed to be for this particular moment. The account in her name, the credentials mirrored from her workstation over months of proximity, the plan that required her trust and her access and her reputation, and, when the time came, her name on a document that would hold up long enough for him to clear the state. She had trusted him the way you trust something you don't have a replacement for. He had counted on that. He had built around it like a load-bearing wall. She picked up the notepad, wrote down the consulting firm's name and routing code and the date of the payment, and circled it twice. Then she walked back to Barrow's office. He was standing at the window when she came in, his back to the door, looking out at the dark geometry of the port. The desk lamp was still on. The Scotch decanter sat on the desk. He hadn't touched it. "Creston recruited Nate 3 years ago," she said from the doorway. "Not 3 months. Not when the debts got bad. 3 years. The consulting payment in the subsidiary chain traces back to a freight brokerage we both worked for." He built the approach slowly. She held out the notepad. He was never just a courier running a finder's fee errand. He was a long-term asset. Creston's people managed him for years. Barrow turned from the window and crossed the room and took the notepad. He read it. His face did the thing it did, didn't change and yet somehow did, the way still water changes when something beneath it moves. The consulting firm's routing code links the first Creston payment to Nate directly, she said. If your people can access that firm's client records, and I understand you have people who access things without subpoenas, you can put Nate inside Creston's operational structure going back 3 years. That's not a finder's fee arrangement. That's a documented long-term intelligence relationship. She paused. Different exposure. different leverage over Creston, a different kind of weapon than $80,000 in a recovery claim. He was still reading. "You're not in this for the money," she said. "You're in it because Creston has been working to dismantle your freight contracts for over a year, and tonight they're moving because they think they bought themselves a window. What I found tells you exactly how long they've been watching you, and through what channel. That's worth more than the $80,000. He looked up. "It gives me evidence of a coordinated intelligence operation against my operations," he said. Not a question. He was mapping it in real time, the way she mapped a column of figures, seeing where each line connected to the next, which is a different category of conversation with Creston than a theft recovery. She watched him. "You're not going to the South Docks tonight to get your money back. You're going to demonstrate that you know what they did. The money was never the point." The silence in the office was the kind that has weight. "No," Barrow said finally. "It wasn't." He set the notepad on his desk. He looked at her for a long, assessing moment, the same look he'd given her 2 hours ago when she'd pushed the folder back across the desk and told him she could read a paper trail. Only now there was something added to it, something that had recalculated. "You could have stopped at the forged credentials," he said. "Established your innocence and left the rest of it as my problem." "Your problem has my name on it," she said, "and I'm very good at closing accounts." He was quiet. The port hummed beyond the glass, low and constant and indifferent to everything happening in this room. Then he walked to the desk and picked up his phone. He spoke 3 sentences to whoever answered, set the phone down and reached for his jacket from the back of the chair. "There's a room at the end of the hall," he said. "Thomas will show you. You're not leaving before I'm back." "I wasn't planning to." He was almost at the door when he stopped. He didn't look back, but his voice carried clearly in the quiet room. "The Creston assets on the South Docks move in 2 hours. I'll be back before morning." A pause. "I always come back. That's the difference between men like me and men like your cousin." Jessa didn't answer right away. She filed the statement next to the scotch and the notepad, and the way he'd taken her seriously from the first moment she'd pushed back, stored it in the part of her mind that kept track of things that hadn't resolved yet. "I'll have the subsidiary chain fully mapped by the time you're done," she said. "Every account, every routing code, every habit Creston's bookkeeper left behind." He stepped out. The door clicked shut. Thomas showed her the room. Someone had left a fresh legal pad on the table and a second laptop already logged into the document system. She sat down, cracked her knuckles, and opened the Creston file from the beginning this time. Down on the South Docks, 2 hours away, freight assets were shifting in the dark. Men who believed they had bought a clean window with someone else's name were moving cargo and making plans. They hadn't factored the bookkeeper into their math. Jessa uncapped the pen, pulled the first document toward her, and got back to work.